So I want to know, were you going for the Eagles or the Chiefs?
Was I going for the Eagles or the Chiefs? I tell you, I like a good defense, and so I will say this: I watched the Super Bowl on TV, and I was very, very impressed with the Eagles' defense, and their offense did plenty to be, that was praiseworthy, but the defense was really pretty unstoppable.
Yeah.
So especially against such a high-powered offense, watching that defense work was a work of art.
Were you expecting that kind of blowout, or?
No, I wasn't expecting the blowout. I did believe that the Eagles were the kind of team, they were built to beat the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, they just looked like the kind of team that they had everything that you need. And I kind of had the sense that whenever there was a big pass that the offense made, the Eagles offense made, and it got called back for a penalty or something, kind of a ticky-tacky penalty. I didn't think they should have called it. But it did tell me that, like, oh, wow, they're going to expose the KC defense pretty quickly. And if you can do even just that little bit and you have a great defense, I had a strong sense that the Eagles. I didn't know going into the game, but once I watched them after the first quarter, I figured there was no way KC was coming back. They would have to play way too risky to be able to do that. And when you play risky with that kind of a defense, when your offense is that risky with that kind of a defense, you're going to have some interceptions. And that's what was. I knew.
I caught it after the first quarter, so I don't know if it was a blowout during the first quarter. I suspect it was
not a blowout, but like I said, you saw every sign that KC trying to play catch up with that kind of a defense would be a disaster.
Yeah. That's wild. I knew by the end of the second quarter, there's no way they're coming back from this. I forget what the score was, but I think we were going for a record. Because I want to say the record for a Super Bowl was 45 points, 55 to 10 or something.
That's
like
right.
that.
At some point, it looked like the Eagles were playing not to lose, which is great. When you're that far ahead, that's what you should do. And they were just trying to run out the clock, and they didn't want to do anything outrageous. And so the score at the very end, KC looked more respectable than they actually were in that sense.
Well, tell me a little bit about your channel. How's it going? What are you doing over there?
It's been a while.
Yeah, has it?
It's been a while. So, okay, there's like a number of factors that probably have kept me off of making videos. Number one, work has been just really, really hectic. A whole lot of things going on. Very, very busy. And not just in terms of how many minutes a day that I'm working, but also in terms of like the drain on me emotionally and all that kind of stuff. Not to complain, but It's just a whole lot going on. And so finding the energy at the end of the day to say, I'm going to go record a video, it hasn't been there. I've been lucky enough to be on a couple of other people's, shows, their recordings. That's worked out. But I really do need to get back on that horse and make some videos because I enjoy doing it. I think it does some good. But there's also the backside of like, I'm pretty careful with the comment section that I know people hate this, but I delete comments just as soon. If I think the comments don't do anybody any good, I just look and say, I'm not going to let that comment last forever there. For the sake of the person who made the comment, I want to do them the favor of not embarrassing themselves, and I often delete those comments pretty quickly. I don't know if people hate this, right? But I do it. I mean, I have young people looking at my channel. I don't get into a ton of big controversies on my channel.
Sure.
So like, it's not that kind of place. It should be a safe place. And so when people start saying the crazy things that they say, I find it probably best
so even in that environment, you're
comments.
Getting kind of toxic comments.
Yeah, the internet's a weird place. The internet's a weird place. It's unfortunate. Because I think a lot of people, maybe it's because they're not that weird, maybe in person, right? Maybe it's just the fact that they're anonymous, and maybe there's just a higher tolerance for things. Like I think about baseball and the kind of things that like at Jesuit High School, for example, when I go to a high school baseball game, we allow the students to get away with certain things at a baseball game that we wouldn't allow them to do during, like, let's say a golf match, right? Like golf and baseball just have different tolerances for what they allow their crowds to do. And baseball, it's even kind of funny, right? There's little things that they do, little cheers they say or whatever that could even be kind of funny. It's part of baseball. And there are rules that certainly you can't cross, but like the tolerance is just much higher for the craziness. And maybe the internet, the tolerance is just in this place that I don't understand. So
I think part of it is the anonymity. People feel like they can get away with a lot more, if they have an anonymous account or if they're just not there in person.
Yeah.
Because I suspect that people would act very differently in person than they do online.
Maybe that's it. Okay, so maybe I think too another factor is when you walk into a church, people are respectful and quiet. Like, you just can't help it. You just become quiet when you walk into a church. When you go to a baseball game, you can't help but cheer.
Right.
Somehow maybe they spend a lot of their time playing video games online or doing other things online that train their brain for not being respectful when they speak or type or whatever, So maybe part of it is that. I don't know, but I find that I just clean up the comments regularly, and it's just a little task that I do, and I'm sure it upsets people, but I
because they'll say you're canceling them.
I mean, here's the thing, and it's not that if somebody makes a respectful comment that disagrees with me, absolutely that comment can stay, no problem at all. But the kinds of things they say, I just don't want to be a platform for that kind of silliness,
Also, if you don't have time to respond to maybe an error that they're spreading that could really harm other people who read it, I wonder if there's wisdom in deleting the comment for that purpose.
Maybe so. Yeah, maybe so. I would hope that people would not buy into the errors that they see just in the comment section. But maybe they are. Maybe
you
they
would
are.
hope.
Yeah, I would hope. I mean, I think there are plenty of errors online. Don't get me wrong, and there are plenty of pretty serious errors in the comment section. I usually try to correct those errors if I see them on somebody else's channel, if I see them on my channel. If it's an error that I think is made honestly, I just think there's just a whole lot of craziness that people don't care. What bothers me too is that, like, this is just a different topic, right? We're talking about theology. We're talking about spiritual things. We're talking about things that matter, in my opinion, matter more than anything. And so we're not just saying, "Hey, LeBron is no good anymore." Like, we're saying, we're talking about whether or not the Pope is the Pope and how dangerous that can be. And, like, it's the kind of things that, if you read canon law, some of this stuff, you might be excommunicating yourself with that comment, and maybe I'm being dramatic, but like, if you take the church seriously, you ought not be putting these things in the comment section for sure.
Yeah, some of it can be really, really dangerous, but it kind of goes back to that censorship debate in the question of free speech, which I've found to be fascinating because, looking at the Catholic perspective on free speech, the best that I can tell from the magisterium, it seems to say that, okay, there's a tolerance of certain errors that can be spread. There's a tolerance, but there is some censorship if it impacts the common good. If it harms the common good, then there should be censorship, according to the magisterium.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. The first is you do not have a natural right to be wrong.
Yeah,
like no one has a natural right to be wrong. Number two, I think you have to look at everything teleologically, right? And so, like, you ask yourself, teleologically, you judge a thing by, is it accomplishing what it was made to accomplish, right? What it was made to do. And so God made you a speaking creature, right? And so are your speech acts glorifying God? And that may sound like the bar is really high at that point, but it kind of ought to be, right? It ought to be. I mean, certainly there's plenty of scripture that talks about bridling your tongue and all that kind of stuff. So, okay, well, YouTube, how different is YouTube then from speech?
I think a lot of people don't realize that. The New Testament does regulate speech. It even tells us to avoid profanity and things like that. I think a lot of people don't like that or don't know that that's there.
So just something to ponder, right? Think about this. Using the Lord's name in vain, right? And how that's a pretty serious thing, right? And that's just words, right? And yet using the Lord's name, it's like it's the kind of, there are certain words that ought to be sacred, certain words that ought to be, and we also say that God is truth, right? In the transcendental sense. So if truth doesn't matter to me, and I just like to fly off the handle and spit out all kind of words and say all these kind of things, like, there ought to be something inside of me that says, wait a second, speech itself is, speech matters, right? Yeah. Speech matters. And I don't mean to be like a prude and say, oh, you can never use bad words or four-letter words, whatever. But, think about the meaning of what we call them four-letter words.
Sure.
The reason why they're four-letter words is because to profane the name of God is to speak God's name. And it was meant only to be spoken in the right context, which meant in the temple. It was the only place you could use God's name, which was a four-letter word, the tetragrammaton, right?
Oh,
it was a four-character word. So it's not because cuss words have only 4 letters. I can think of a bunch of cuss words, to my shame. I can think of a bunch of cuss words that have more than 4 letters, and a couple that might have just 2. Like 2 or 3 letters. But the idea is that, like, okay, so God's name shouldn't be spoken out in the streets. Like, it's an abuse to use God's name just out in the streets whenever you feel like it. So that's where we get this connection with the word profanity. Is because these are words that ought not be spoken. Mm-hmm. And when you think of those words that are typically profanity, they usually have to do with intimacy. They usually have to do with privacy, like things that you just don't do out in public, right? So they're bodily functions that we try to keep private. We try to keep to ourselves. Okay, so those words ought to matter, right? Words ought to matter a lot, and I think that spiritually, when we let that go, it's similar to blasphemous images, right? And I think it's something that in the East, I think they have preserved in a great way, and in the West, I think you see it a little bit more with statues and decorations in church that way. But like we ought to take more seriously those things which symbolize important or special other things, whether that's bodily functions or intimacy between a man and a woman, or even things that are holy that have to do with, not even, but maybe first, things that are holy that belong in the temple, that we ought not just let ourselves go and be totally free to say whatever we want and make fun of things, make jokes about things like that. Again, I'm not a prude about. I'm not saying you can never use those words. I
get what you're saying, and I'm glad you mentioned the tetragrammaton and the use of it in the temple. Remember when I was learning Hebrew as a kid in Israel, we would read through the Torah, and every time you came to the divine name, they teach you not to actually read it. Instead, you substitute it with the word Adonai.
That's right.
Which means Lord. My Lord. So I remember that, and so I knew even then, okay, this name is special. Yeah. And you can actually still see that to this day in the Catholic liturgy, because to my knowledge, Yahweh, the divine name, is never actually mentioned liturgically. It's used by theologians and in discussions. Like, you'll see that in Catholic circles. It's mentioned in books, but not in the liturgy, to my knowledge.
There was a song that was very popular that said, Yahweh, I know you are near. And they've now changed it to, Oh Lord.
So they took it out. Yeah.
And it was because several people who study this stuff, and this is what they do, and they kind of looked at that and said, rightly so, said, this is not in our tradition of worship to just throw this name out there. Even in church, we ought not be using it as part of our hymn, part of the hymns that we sing.
Yeah, and so that's kind of a continuation of Judaism and Christianity's background in Judaism, because even today Jews won't say the divine name. They'll say Hashem, the name, or something like that, but they won't actually say the name.
That's right. And I mean, we try to talk around this sometimes. We say gosh and golly, and we say and okay, you might get laughed at if you talk that way, but at the same time,
I do that all the time.
At the same time, I think working your way around the use of some words is a good instinct. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I wholeheartedly agree. Now, I want to ask you about something that has been coming up a lot in the news lately, sadly, and that is attacks on priests, on altars, just all sorts of things, attacks in churches. I mean, I think I did 3 shows in the last week.
Yeah.
You had one instance where a priest in Winnipeg was being attacked. You had another one in Spokane, Washington, where a priest was attacked. You have another in St. Peter's Basilica where the altar was attacked and arguably desecrated. I don't know if this is something that a lot of priests are thinking in the back of their mind when they're doing the liturgy, that, hey, there could be something that's about to happen. As a priest, is this something that's just kind of, in the back of your mind, like, I need to be prepared for anything?
I think anybody that spends enough time in a church, you're going to see a lot of maybe the wrong word to use is crazy, but it certainly feels like it. You're going to see a lot of crazy. Okay, so, and I mean everything. I think I texted you about an event that I was involved in, and just a few days ago.
Tell me about that again.
Okay, so the Byzantine Catholic Church that I serve is not that far from where I live, but it is about an hour away from where the deacon lives, and he usually is the one who takes care of the church. And so, in the little Ring doorbell, he saw somebody jump the fence and cover up the Ring doorbell camera. And so he calls me up and says, "Can you go check on this?" Right. So I hopped in my car, drove straight over, and I was there within a matter of just a couple of minutes. And sure enough, there was somebody who had jumped over the fence, covered up the camera, and then just laid down in the grass and went to sleep. Right. So that's not, nobody attacked me or anything like that.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing happens all the time. So I've seen people walk up into the sanctuary and then lay on their back and look up at the ceiling and have a moment with the Lord. I don't know, that kind of thing. I've had somebody during adoration come up before and inspect the book. That was, so the way we do adoration in a different church is that we have like this binder that has all the prayers in it that like sort of sits in the sanctuary on the steps where I go down, where I kneel. And so I can read the book from where I'm kneeling. And so when I get up from that spot, the book stays there. Anyway, this guy felt like he should inspect the book and make sure there was nothing wrong in the book that he didn't agree with or whatever, and then it's the Blessed Sacrament is exposed. And so you want to be just as discreet as you can be to tell the guy, get out of the sanctuary, please,
Right.
So there's just these kinds of things happen all the time. Now, I've never been physically attacked. I've had to physically remove people before who fought back a little bit, but nobody ever, jumped on me or anything like that. I don't think I'm this big imposing guy, but I don't look like a pushover, and physically
Right.
I don't think I look like a pushover. So I think you might have some guys who might worry a little bit more than I would need to worry about it. But we encounter a lot of crazy things a lot of the time, and especially if you have like a downtown parish where you have a bigger homeless problem. I think, for example, this example of a guy jumping the fence at St. Nicholas, the Super Bowl was going on downtown, and I think that there were blue lights everywhere. There's cops everywhere, all over downtown New Orleans, and I think that pushed out a lot of homeless people from downtown over just a couple of miles where our parish is. And so these kind of things happen a lot. You have to deal with a lot of mental illness. You have to deal with a lot of drug abuse. You have to deal with a lot of, extreme poverty that sometimes happens because of some of these other things. And so we deal with this kind of stuff a lot.
Yeah.
I would say that being attacked with a knife is out of the ordinary for sure. I would say that having a punch thrown is out of the ordinary for sure. Mm-hmm. Whether or not right now is like a heightened time for that, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I have things yelled at me on a from time to time, right? Or people trying to get away with something crazy that I have to physically get in there and stop them from doing. Often in the streets, using the a quiet place like the church as the place they're going to use the restroom, or maybe try to take a bath in a holy water font or something like that. That's not that uncommon that somebody would do that, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Take a bath in the holy water font?
Well, just give themselves
Goodness.
like washing their hair in the holy water font or something like that, right? That happens. And for some people, it's this religious experience they're having. For other people, they just like the cold water, and so they're just doing it for that, So, I've seen some weird stuff.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
One of the comments that I got very frequently from these 3 videos that I did just recently on these various attacks is people saying this is one of the reasons why we should bring back altar rails. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Do you think that would help cut down on some of these attacks, or not?
I'll say this: I'm in favor of bringing them back for a number of reasons. That's not the first one that I would think of, right? And I think that anybody who's hell bent on attacking a priest, that altar rail's probably not going to help stop them, not going to deter them very much. But I do think that altar rails are good. I believe that the sanctuary is a very special place. And we ought to have reminders that it's such a special place. We ought to have physical reminders that tell us that this is where 2 things are happening that don't happen really in any other religion, right? Mm-hmm. Even in some Christian denominations, this isn't what's happening, where you have the place of the altar and you have the people, and that those 2 places meet, okay? So the altar rail, some people think of it as a barrier or a separation, but I don't think so. I think it's like, okay, when 2 people kiss, they are not divided by their lips, right? Their lips is it's where they meet, right? So that's what an iconostasis is. That's what the communion rail, the altar rail, is actually the old iconostasis. There was a rood screen in the West. You had the rood screen, which was just the Western version of the iconostasis. And that kept shrinking and getting smaller and smaller, and now it becomes the place where people still come and meet the Lord, right? This is where they they come to receive communion, and the priest sort of pierces that veil with the body of Christ, right? But you want those two places to be held with some sort of like integrity for the two spaces. So having a divider between the two, I hate to even call it a divider, but have that place marked with a communion rail or an iconostasis in the east, something like that, I think is a great idea, and I think it's a good thing. And I think it would keep people from casually walking up into the sanctuary, which happens a lot. And usually I don't know, I always get irked when somebody just kind of marches right up into the sanctuary without any sense of reverence for for the fact that they just crossed the line into a different kind of a space where a different kind of a thing is happening. So I think it's important.
Yeah, it seems to bring a little bit more awareness of holy space. This is not common and ordinary place. And, just reverence, I guess, for the sacrament itself. It seems to facilitate that. Yeah.
I was reading a book not long ago that it was describing some ancient liturgies. I mean, really ancient. We're talking about the first few centuries. Yeah. And apparently they used to build these churches with a bridge, like literally a physical bridge inside the church, right, that went from the sanctuary to the nave. And the priest with communion would walk out onto this bridge, and communicants would walk up and meet him on the bridge, and receive communion that way. And as strange as that sounds, it is a beautiful concept, right, to think about people being so aware that what's happening right now is so special that you would have an indoor bridge from the sanctuary to the nave, right? Or in the east where there's a door, and the door features prominently in the liturgy, right? I mean, there's depending on which door in fact you can't even go in and out of this door unless you are the priest, and it is during the liturgy at the right time. Every other time you should use one of the other doors off to the side, just because that symbol is so important, that there's a meeting of two worlds that's happening right now, where the sacrifice is happening in the altar, the recapitulation of Calvary, and then where the people bring themselves to that spot.
So you mentioned an iconostasis here. So for those who may not be familiar, you celebrate the Latin Rite liturgy, both in its extraordinary form and ordinary form. So your Latin Mass.
Yeah.
Oh well, yeah. But you have before. You have before, right? So your Latin Mass, your Novus Ordo, but also you do the Byzantine liturgy.
That's right.
The Divine Liturgy of Chrysostom, and also, I guess, St. Basil on some weeks, presumably.
That's right.
Yeah. So, given that you do both of those and you kind of live in both worlds, do you think that that's maybe impacted your understanding of the liturgy?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah.
For me, it felt like right at first it felt like learning a foreign language, right? Where you're like, man, this is hard. I'm having to constantly recall what I should be doing. It doesn't feel like I'm not used to this. And the truth is, I'd seen half a dozen Eastern liturgies at all before I started celebrating, or concelebrating the divine liturgies at St. Nicholas. So it was, for me, it was very, very difficult to kind of for it to finally feel natural. Took a really long time, and thank God people have been patient with me, and I had a good deacon, and I've had other priests who were, showing me the way, right? Helping me to really receive that liturgy, but all through it, like learning a foreign language, you begin to recognize what is the same, and you begin to recognize what's different, why it might be different. You begin to see some nuance there, like learning a foreign language. You start to recognize some nuance in your own language, right? So, take for example, in Greek, the word koinos, right, means, it has two meanings. One is common, and one is unclean. Okay, that you would have a word that would mean those two things at the same time, right? It's sort of interesting to think that, okay, so to be some common things might be seen as unfit for what's happening in things that are ritually clean, right? So what is ritually clean, what is ritually unclean, and all that kind of stuff. And also the word common would fall into the unclean, would be paired in the same word to be unclean. Okay, so now you realize that there's some nuance, and the connotation means everything when you use that word, koinos, right? And so now you have to think with nuance to be able to speak. Well, once you get in the practice of thinking with nuance, you are you're thinking better, right? You're thinking in a more strong, you're thinking in a much better way now. Yeah. So just like learning a foreign language, or just like learning a second language, you begin to see words that are, antonyms and synonyms and all this kind of stuff that makes you realize and have to practice thinking in a nuanced way. Sure. But when you practice thinking in a nuanced way, you're thinking better. Right, you're thinking in a way that is superior to just sort of grunting and moaning your way through life, right? with a foreign language, it works in a very similar way, I find, at least with liturgy, right? So, all of the masses that I'd been celebrating or that I attended in my life, most of them anyway, didn't take a whole lot of thought about it. Like I knew when someone said "the Lord be with you," I just sort of instinctually knew what that meant, or at least I'd practiced it so much when I was little, I just knew what they meant, and I would reply back, when I was little, it was, and also with you, and then it became "and with your spirit." But even that little change, right, made you stop and say, well, what exactly are we saying? Oh, this is actually not just somebody being nice and saying "the Lord be with you," or hello, welcome everybody, the force be with you, right? There's something going on here that we are repeating a greeting that goes all the way back, thinking that way. And seeing that in the liturgy has helped me appreciate the liturgy, the Latin version of the liturgy, so much more, paying much more attention to what's happening there. The same thing with, I'll give you another example, the corporal. As I unfold the corporal onto the altar, when I see the antimension in the Eastern liturgy, you've got an image of Jesus on there, and he's being laid in the tomb, and it's something similar like to the Shroud of Turin, which I believe the Shroud of Turin for a while was used as an altar covering, right? So there's this sense of like, oh, it all makes sense now why that image would be there. And a corporal in the Latin Rite is just a white piece of material that you unfold. But the idea that this would be something like the burial cloths, right? That the body of Christ would be on this cloth, and that the same reverence that we would have treated the real body of Christ in the tomb, we want to do that in the liturgy, right? We want to, because this is the body of Christ. We want to treat it that way. And so I've come to appreciate, I guess, the Western liturgy by celebrating the Eastern liturgy.
Yeah. I also saw something the other day where a bishop was talking about making changes to the liturgy, at least in his own personal liturgies. And he was talking about how when he does the ordinary form, he silently says the anaphora, where nobody can hear it, but he changes the anaphora from the ordinary form to the one in the extraordinary form by his own volition. Now, I know it's a little different because he's a bishop and they might have a little bit more leeway, and perhaps you can speak to that. But for a priest, what are the limits to adaptations that people can make liturgically?
Well, yeah, every time it's mentioned, we're told don't make adaptations. Right? We're told don't make this stuff up. I mean, if you open up the missal, the used to be called the sacramentary. If you open that up, there are some things where it says use these words or use these or similar words. Right? So they want you expressing what's right here. That's what they want you to do. And that's about the most wiggle room that you have, right? It's like, use these or similar words. So if you're saying, well, I don't like these words, I want them to express something else, and I don't like what these words are expressing. To me, that's already territory that you shouldn't be in, even when you're given an option to say words that you feel more comfortable saying, right? So yeah, I was as a priest, certainly as a priest, right? I'm a nobody as a priest. I receive the liturgy, and I celebrate the liturgy according to what the book says, right? So I do the red, I say the black. That's what I'm going to do. Once in a while, like I'm trying to think of an example, like where I might go off script is if something really out of the ordinary is happening and everyone in the congregation can see. I'll give you an example. I was celebrating Mass one time I was down in, where was I? I was in Puerto Rico. And a bat got into the chapel, and a bat landed on my chasuble, and is like, just sitting there on my chasuble while I'm trying to say Mass.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously, this happens, right? So what? Yeah, look, I got stories for you, right? If you want to hear some, stories, I got stories. Anyway, so I had to stop the liturgy and remove the bat, and I had to say something about it. I'm like, lo siento a todos. We have a strange situation here. Anyway, and you go back to the liturgy. So like, you can't say, sorry, I'm a robot, and I have to, no matter, even if there's a bat hanging off of the chasuble, I've got to keep going because this is where I'm at. You ought to be human about what you're doing, right? And so you ought to feel some some opportunities, there may be an opportunity or a situation where you have to, take the opportunity to go off script just a tiny bit. But in general, I think you ought to be, as a priest, you ought to be trying to celebrate the Mass that the church has given you. Now, when you're a bishop, it's a little bit different, because a bishop is the custodian, right? And so taking care of the liturgy, you may have some, I would be very careful never to criticize what a bishop is doing, making changes, making adaptations, praying the prayer the way that the bishop sees it is right to do. I'm just not going to criticize that. I don't understand it, though. I will tell you, I don't understand making those kinds of changes, because to me, this is the liturgy that the church, which is bigger than any one bishop,
right,
that the church has given you. The Pope can make some changes, but when he does, he's making changes for the liturgy. So, for example, Pope Francis added Saint Joseph to the Eucharistic prayer, right? So you're praying you're commemorating Mary, all the saints, the martyrs, whatever. He add Joseph in there is what Pope Francis had us all do. And so he's making a change, not just because he likes to make the change, but because he's making a change for all of us. So I'm still a receiver of that liturgy, and I still, it's the liturgy of the church. It's not for me. It's not for me to judge whether or not this is good enough or not, or needs some changes or not, or anything like that. And I got some personal opinions about what I think might be more effective, but I'm not going to play any games during the liturgy.
Yeah. It seems a lot safer to not do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand too that you should look maybe at your audience who's listening to you, but then again, what you're talking about is that someone who is. These are quiet prayers. These are prayers that are said in a low voice.
Yeah, and this bishop was saying he has a problem theologically with the ordinary form and the prayers there. He says that they're too problematic, so he goes.
That's a whole different issue altogether. I would say we're not talking about somebody who's changing the words for the sake of the people who are listening. Right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who says, "I find these words unacceptable. I find some other words are better, so I'm going to use these other words." That's just not territory that I, as a priest, certainly can't go there. And I have all kinds of questions. If a bishop does that, I would have all kinds of questions. I don't know what the answers to them would be. So I'm not saying anybody's totally wrong for having done that, but I don't know the answer to why that would be okay.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's fair. You spoke of custody, I think was the term you used, custody of the liturgy. Well, speaking of which, traditionis custodes.
Yeah, they are custodians. Yeah,
so right. Speaking of, there's been a whole lot of liturgy wars in the church. We've seen a resurgence of the liturgy debates and liturgy wars since Traditionis Custodes, the document from Pope Francis, restricting access to the Missal of 1962. Because of that, again, sparked a whole lot of debates that are still ongoing. What do you think? Do you think that these debates are healthy? Do you think that the situation is to a point it's not very good? And how do you think the church can move forward past this stuff?
Well, I'll tell you this. First of all, I'm a fan of Pope Benedict XVI, right? I found him to be a very, very capable theologian, and he had a special place in his heart for a lot of the traditions that I also have a place in my heart for the same thing. So I have a great respect for what he was trying to do with the liturgy. I think sort of counterintuitively, Benedict XVI had a strong sense of saying that we ought to have some ability to flex according to the people that we're celebrating Mass for. So it was out of what might sound like a liberal instinct that he said that a more widespread use of the Missal before the Novus Ordo, right? That we'd be able to do that. And it's more of a liberal instinct of saying, hey, you have some people who are very attached to this older way of saying the Mass, and because they're very attached to that, let's throw them a bone. Let's allow ourselves to celebrate Mass for them this way, a more widespread use of that. And it wasn't that he was saying this is a superior liturgy and the Novus Ordo is terrible, so leave behind the Novus Ordo. He just said that you have some people, we ought to minister to those people that way. Okay. So what was the result of that over time? Certainly Pope Francis believes that it wasn't an effective way of drawing those people in. Those people meaning those people who felt somewhat disaffected by the changes to the liturgy after Vatican II. Pope Francis feels like that's not the effect that it had. It didn't draw those people closer in. that's a different question than which liturgy scratches that itch inside of me to worship this way. That's just a different question. I think a lot of young people are amazed by those older traditions. They talk about the experience of the traditional Latin Mass is it had such an effect on them that it makes them love Jesus more. It doesn't always make them love the church in 2025 more. In fact, I think the Pope sees that sometimes it draws a division between, well, I love Jesus more, but I love the church less. That's a pretty dangerous place to be. And then you have this other phenomenon of priests who are going to be celebrating that traditional Latin Mass, the ancient use of it. They are going to be more careful about the liturgy.
Yeah.
Anybody who's willy-nilly and playing a guitar and all that kind of, they're not going to say, oh, let me just put that aside and go celebrate in the traditional Latin Mass, right?
Right.
That kind of a priest is going to be on the Novus Ordo all the way. The kind of priest who's careful and all that, he's going to be more attracted to the TLM, right? So you now have a division of, you have your most liturgically careful, maybe even gifted liturgically priests doing this, and then you have none of those guys on the other side. So you see the Novus Ordo suffers because, especially if you're talking about those priests who won't celebrate the Novus Ordo, right? That then you're going to see the Novus Ordo suffer rather than let the Novus Ordo be shaped and formed by people who care a lot about the liturgy. It's like, yeah. So you see this division happening, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, every TLM you go to is going to seem better than every Novus Ordo that you go to. And I think you go back in time to the 1950s, let's say, and you're going to find a low mass that some, Father McGillicuddy is celebrating on any given day, and a lot of times those were not impressive liturgies, right?
The
those
11-minute mass,
right, the 11-minute. You've heard about the 11-minute mass, all that kind of stuff. Those are going to be less impressive, and they're not going to really be. There's a mystagogy that's supposed to be happening during Mass, right? That a person's supposed to be led through the mysteries, taught by the mysteries, and that's what you'd want at every Mass. You didn't get that all the time in the 1950s. There's a reason why so many bishops and cardinals were in favor of revising the liturgy. Why they nearly unanimously voted to make these changes, including some pretty famous anti-Novus Ordo bishops actually signed off on it.
Very true.
Because they felt something wasn't quite feeding the people the way that it should. Benedict XVI makes this point in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, that he said you'll find a lot of saints who were very devoted to the Eucharist during, between 1500 and, and 1970, right? You'll find a lot of people a lot of saints very, very devoted to the Eucharist. You'll find very few devoted to the liturgy. Now, why is that? Is there something deficient in that liturgy? I don't know, but I find a lot of people today are very devoted to it. So in the end, the Pope gets to decide. I do my very best to take what the Pope says and say, I want to be the Pope's guy, right? I want to do what the Pope wants. I want to let him lead me. I want to let the Pope be my shepherd. And certainly the Pope has the right to say what we're going to do for the liturgy, right? And so when the Pope says, under only very limited circumstances, am I okay with the traditional Latin Mass? I'm not going to spend a lot of time fighting it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to undermine that desire that he has to lead the church. If I were Pope, I might have done something different.
Sure.
But I'm certainly, I'm doing my very best to be on the Pope's side and to accept his desire for the liturgy. I also have seen a number of masses that the Pope himself has celebrated, Novus Ordo masses, and they seem pretty good. Like they seem to be pretty well celebrated. Let's say, right? And so I take those cues as well. I also say, look, I'm not going to be the kind of guy who ad libs a bunch of stuff. I'm not going to be the kind of guy who breaks out with a guitar song in the middle of Mass, because certainly that's not what the Pope is doing. His vision for the liturgy seems to be a pretty solid Novus Ordo Mass, and so I'm doing my best to do that.
Having been to some of his, I can certainly say, at least the ones that I went to St. Peter's Basilica were really well done. What about the average parishioner in Catholic that you talk to? Are they really looking for something like the Latin Mass, or are they pretty well satisfied with the Novus Ordo?
I think there's a lot of them that are dissatisfied with a lot of Novus Ordo Masses that they go to. So I don't want to play it down. There are some awful Novus Ordo, and look, I don't want to bash the Jesuits. The Jesuits. I'm a very proud Jesuit myself, but I've seen some Jesuits do some wild things. I've seen some really bad things. Let's just say I've seen some bad things. But I would say that the average person out there wouldn't know what to do with. Just wouldn't know what to do with the traditional Latin Mass. They just wouldn't know how to participate in it. They wouldn't know exactly what they're supposed to do. They feel more at home with the Novus Ordo because that's just what they grew up with, most of them, maybe if they're looking for something different, and it might strike them as something different if they went once in a blue moon to a traditional Latin Mass. But most of them, they would be put off if I started Mass completely in Latin and everything were Latin and I was ad orientem all the way. I think for some of them they might like parts of it, but to be what Pope Benedict XVI called a liturgical activist, I think that's a mistake. Like I wouldn't want to just go force this down anybody's throat, and I kind of understand why they might have a hard time understanding their role in it. Now, at the same time, the Novus Ordo, as it's been celebrated in America by most priests, I think it's left the laity not understanding the depth of the liturgy the way that they could. So take, for example, just liturgical music, for example. And I don't think this is the fault of the Novus Ordo, but it is true that in America, if you'd say, let's talk about music at Mass, people would say, okay, you need an opening hymn, you need maybe a communion meditation, and a closing hymn. And so you get this kind of sandwich of songs that you need. And that's not what liturgical music is meant to be, right? Liturgical music, there are prayers that ought to be sung if you can, if you can handle it. Now, a lot of times my singing is pretty bad, so I don't I don't sing all that much, but I find it important to sing the Kyrie. I find it important to sing the Sanctus and to sing one in Greek, to sing the other in Latin. I find that to be a good thing to do to introduce people to what liturgical chanting should sound like. Now, I mentioned I don't sing very well, but when I started singing for the Divine Liturgy, like my chanting is awful, right? But so I basically kind of give it this monotone chant. But to see that there are parts that in the Divine Liturgy that you must chant, that's one of those things that trained my mind to think, hey, singing's not really. Well, it's good if you can do it, but no big deal if you don't. Like I find that all of a sudden, hey, singing is a form of worship that ought to be incorporated into the Mass, into the Divine Liturgy,
So one thing that's been a lot on my mind is how can we get past the liturgy wars that we've been seeing since Traditionis Custodes?
Well, part of it's going to be attrition, right? So part of it is, if you look at all the statistics about how a young priest might identify himself and all that kind of stuff, you see fewer and fewer priests who are interested in what I would think of as offensive liturgies that are, sort of forcing some kind of weird things, into the liturgy, things that are. At the same time, you see these more conservative priests, we do have to be careful not to make tradition be a contest, right? Where look, I'm every new little thing that I see that I find out was traditional, so I'm going to try to just squeeze that into everything. And I need to send every signal that I can to show people how traditional I am. So, I need not just a cassock and surplice sometimes, but I need the most lacy surplice I can find. And I need to just constantly signal to everybody that I'm on your side. If you're the kind of guy that wants tradition in the liturgy, those kind of things. I think we have to be careful of that because there's, I think that's part of what Pope Francis has complained about with the more traditional Latin masses. He said, it's not that he doesn't like it because it's traditional. He doesn't like it because it's kind of, I don't know a nice way to say it, but it's, the Pope has used some pretty rough words to describe that crowd.
Has. He's been very critical of
right. I don't want to, I want to stay away from some of those words or whatever, but that's and that burns people up a lot of times, right? Nobody wants to be called that for wearing something so lacy and for wearing something so whatever. But the Pope he's making a point that I think is worth making, and he's said this a lot, and I think it's a good point. You don't want your liturgy to become a museum. And by a museum, I don't mean something that preserves older things. I mean something that just takes older things and puts them on display to be looked at and not participated in. What we want to do is really and truly participate, have this a real live living participation in a liturgy which is alive, right?
Sure.
And so I think that if a layperson wanted to, for example, see liturgy improve, I would say improve your parish life overall. Mm-hmm. So like celebrate the feast days that are important to that particular parish. That particular parish's saint, celebrate that. Celebrate Advent, go all out on Mardi Gras and then Advent, go all out on Christmas, try to do up those kind of special moments, and then you'll find that I think bleed into your regular Sunday masses to make them more alive and more special, more what they're supposed to be as time consecrated to acts of worship. And so, yeah, I think younger priests are going to save us, right, from some of the bad stuff. I think that active parishioners who are living out a life that is really connected into the church are going to help the liturgy as well. I think it was the Orthodox theologian Schmemann who talks about there's no such thing as secular. For a real Christian, there's no such thing as secular. And I think that's right. That's really right. Your whole life ought to be infused with what you believe about God. When you live that way, you're going to see what happens on Sunday improve, and you're also going to be like, I think, more and more okay with things that where the corners might get knocked off by some strange circumstances. I'm thinking of, for example, like babies crying in church really drives some people crazy, and I'm like, well, then you just need to be around more babies crying,
right?
You need to just be around that more.
It's fascinating to see what really upsets some people. To me, that's never bothered me.
I grew up in a really big family, so I've heard a lot of babies cry. So maybe I'm just kind of not tuned to it. But
it's a good sign, right?
I think so.
It's a healthy parish.
That's right. That's life. Yeah. So I don't know if that will solve like the liturgy wars problem, but I do think certainly your own local parish, you will like it more if you participate more than just for that 1 hour on Sunday.
Yeah. One thing that comes up a lot is the question of criticizing the Pope. What are your thoughts here? Do you think that it can be done in a constructive way, or should never be done?
Yeah. Well, what does it even mean to say in a constructive way, right? So a lot of times when we talk about criticizing another person, we're talking about correcting that person, right? So, you say something wrong, and I feel like I have the duty to instruct the ignorant is kind of the old-fashioned term for it, right? It's one of the works of mercy that I should instruct the ignorant. But do you think the Pope is listening to the criticism that somebody has, a KC Royals fan, mom who decides to say some terrible things about the Pope in a comment section on YouTube on somebody's video, you're certainly not going to achieve that. You're not actually correcting the Pope. The Pope's not listening to you. Maybe he is, but I doubt it. Right? He's not going to be corrected by your comment. Most of the time, those comments, those critiques of the Pope are there's nothing there anyway, right? So it's often a straw man. It's often whatever. And if you know as well as I do that if you try to point that out, you're just Popesplaining or whatever. But that's unfortunate because there's just a lot of. Number two, it's a spiritual minefield. When you spend a lot of your waking hours critiquing, like rather than just receiving what the Pope is telling you and saying, I'm receiving that instruction from the shepherd, right? Instead, I'm constantly saying, do I like this or not like this? Do I think this is good or do I think this is bad? I'm spending some time thinking about what he said in a way that is really just critiquing it rather than spending some time receiving it. Like just first receive it, okay? Number three, you do have some theologians who I think have the I don't know if you want to call it the duty or the certainly have the right to maybe go a little bit into some area where they may say, like, look, the Pope said this could use some clarification. This could, with charity, you can look at these kind of things in a way that maybe your average lay person can't. But even then, I would be very, very careful because what we get, if what we're doing is responding to a headline, that says more about what the news has to say than it does about what the Pope has to say, right? So you have to be very, very careful that you're not receiving something the Pope said first through the filter of the media. We've seen this happen with Fiducia Supplicans, for example. There's room to say that Fiducia Supplicans says things in such a way that can be confusing, whatever, okay. But most of the time, people are responding to the first headlines that they saw that came from all these major media outlets that said the Pope has said that we got to bless gay marriages, right? And like every word of that sentence I just said is wrong, right?
Yeah,
right. Every word I just said is,
but it's still the takeaway that people
it's still the takeaway a lot of
day.
people have, right? And yeah. So I believe that when it comes to criticizing what the Pope said, you have to just ask yourself: Am I entering a spiritual minefield that I'm going to be doing myself a big disservice? And am I going to lose faith in Jesus's promises to the church? Am I going to lose faith in God's, to me at least, a very clear way that God wants his church to be, right? And as wounded as the body of Christ was after the resurrection is what I think the church is going to look like. So I'm not pretending there's nothing wrong here. The house is not on fire. I'm not trying to say that. There are some problems, but I also can rest easy in the promises of Christ that we're in the right place. We're doing, we're in the right place. And so if I spend a lot of time criticizing the Pope and saying, I know I'm in the right place, but boy, we have a terrible Pope, how long will I believe that I'm in the right place before I feel like I have to take a hike and I got to go somewhere else, and I need some fresh air, and I need some separation, and then ultimately I find myself divorced from the very church that Jesus himself founded on the rock, and wants St. Peter and the See of Peter to be an extension of that. He names Peter the rock, right? Mm-hmm. And even though Jesus is the rock, he names Peter the rock. So we're supposed to see that. We're supposed to see that played out. Okay, so if I spend a lot of time criticizing the Pope that way, it's a spiritual minefield. For theologians, you just need to be very, very careful that you better have your ducks in a row if you're gonna say that the Pope is wrong about something or expressed himself the wrong way, or all that kind of stuff. And so then you have to ask yourself, even if you are a theologian, am I helping people by exposing some mistake I think the Pope made? Or do I really, if I really want to take my time with this and really try to find the right channels to maybe get some message that to the Pope that what he said is out of line, or is there somebody somewhere that I can do some good with my critique, rather than just say like, hey, guess what? I have a critique of the Pope, and I bet I can express it so well that you're going to believe me, and now you'll be on my side. You'll be on my team. And it's very unfortunate, but I see a lot of theologians who aren't really speaking to the Pope. What they're doing is they're speaking to their audience, and they're winning points. They're scoring points with their audience. You see this in debates a lot of time. They're not really debating the person across the table from them. What they're really doing is just trying to say things to score points with their audience, the people who like them. And that happens a lot, and theologians are not immune to that temptation either. So none of these things are to say that everything the Pope has ever said is perfect.
Right.
And I don't think anybody, believes that. Nobody out there is what you would call a radical ultramontanist, right? So some people get confused, and they think that ultramontanism is a heresy. I could be wrong, but I don't think ultramontanism is by itself a heresy, meaning that you take serious what the Pope has to say, and you believe that the Pope cannot lead his flock into error and all that kind of stuff. Most of us would probably say that ultramontanism, some form of ultramontanism, is what we would need to hold to. There is something called radical ultramontanism, which is to say that every Pope is a saint, every Pope is a theologian, can never make a mistake, can never, he's absolutely perfect. That's radical ultramontanism. Nobody really holds to that. I don't know. I've never met a single person.
I don't know anybody who actually believes that.
Yeah.
Certainly. They might exist, but I mean, at that point, we're talking about maybe 100 people out of 1.3 billion Catholics. Like,
I've never met one.
I don't really know who these people are.
I've never met one. Yeah.
I don't know why anybody would take any time attempting to refute that position.
That's right. So a radical ultramontanist is in trouble. Is wrong. But there's something about ultramontanism. There's a reason why the Church has always had. Why would we call the successor to Peter the Holy Father? I mean, those are some special words we're using now, right?
Protestants hate it too.
Yeah, they do. But we use words like Holy Father, and those are words that are very, very meaningful. Why would the Church have this tradition of using those words? We didn't just use them for the popes that we liked. We use those words for every pope
because of the office. Right?
Because of the office, and so we ought to have all kinds of respect for that pope. And so I see. Not a lot of people on the internet. Not a lot of people on the internet are kind of like just asking themselves basic questions like, am I doing any good? Is it hurting me spiritually? Am I speaking to my audience, or am I really critiquing the Pope? I see way too much of it. And I'll tell you, for myself, speaking for myself, I've got vows that mean that I'm just never going to allow myself to really even spend a lot of time judging the Pope. So, in some sense, I think it's good for me spiritually to always try to see, what is the Pope saying? What is he saying that might be challenging to me, and how do I find myself accepting what he's saying that might be challenging to me? Not because I think he's wrong, so it's a challenge to me. I'm saying that what he's saying is challenging my current idea about something, right? So if the Pope is going to be a really good shepherd, if he's going to be any kind of shepherd at all, then the sheep have to trust him. Even if he's wrong, I do believe I'd rather stand before God and say, look, I followed the popes that you gave me. Now, Lord, if you picked that Pope, I assumed it's because you knew I was better off believing, with that Pope, where that Pope tried to lead me was a good place, that I was better off because that even if that Pope might have been a little wrong here or there, I was better off being obedient, an obedient son to that Pope. Maybe some people are called to some different kind of life, but that's the life that I, as a Jesuit, with the vows that I have, that's how I have to find my peace. And this may sound like a cope or something like that, but that's where I find my peace.
Do you think the people who are just really obsessed with criticizing the Pope are just in a really negative space? I mean, you would think that would have a toll on their life. You would think that would impact them negatively.
It sounds like it. I mean, when's the last time you saw someone joyfully critique the Pope? Yeah. It usually comes across as either painful for them, right? And I feel for those folks, right? Let me say it to the camera, right? Yeah. If you don't like the Pope, I feel for you. I really, really do. That's a tough place to be. It's tough to keep the faith whenever you don't like the successor to Peter, and I feel for anybody like that. I really do. And I even, to some degree, I often find a lot of common ground with people like that, because their concerns are very often the very same concerns that I would have if I believed the news about the Pope, or if I didn't read the context that the Pope said whatever he said in, or whatever. So like I look, it's no secret. I think that most people would describe me as very conservative, right? That's where I'm at. The big difference is that I'm not going to find myself angry at the Pope. I'm not going to find myself looking for ways to critique the Pope. And when you let all that go and you try to make friends with the Pope in a sense, right, in your heart, you will find some peace there. And I see a lot of people who, if I see something that looks like joy, it's often like this kind of wicked, like, oh man, look, I caught him again. I caught the Pope again in another bad thing. Usually it's a straw man, but I caught the Pope again at another bad thing, and I get to show everybody how I'm really the Catholic here, and so it's led to some things I think are not just sad because I see a person who's either sort of like finding some kind of wicked thrill out of critiquing the Pope, or this deep sadness, but also like kind of weird territory where the Pope isn't the Pope anymore. Yeah. And I know it. Like I in my own world, I've figured it out. The cardinals may have unanimously, agreed that he's the Pope, but I know better. Like I get it. Or did you notice that the Pope excommunicated the one guy who knew that he wasn't really the Pope, and who went and got reordained, by the way, reordained by another guy who was also excommunicated, and all this kind of stuff. Like, if that's where you're at, if that's where your theory got you, just take a step back, take a deep breath, and realize that what you're describing is like apocalypse right now, and it's not where we're at.
A lot of people think that's where we're at. We're in the end times, and he's the Antichrist and all that.
Well, then take some comfort that Jesus wins in the end, right? take some comfort that Jesus wins in the end, and in the end, I love Jesus with all my heart, and I hope God doesn't hold it against me that I've been following the anti-pope.
Well, what about those who would say, well, Father, you're just Popesplaining and you're in denial? What do you say to that?
I mean, okay. So what the phenomenon of Popesplaining? Shouldn't we all have like a little Popesplainer inside of us? Shouldn't we all be trying to defend the Pope? And I know we've had some bad popes in history, and this might be one of them that history remembers him poorly. I don't know, but I know in the end, those who left the faith because there was a bad pope, history doesn't remember them very well either. And so I don't want to be that way today. I don't want to be the guy who leaves either.
With the term, though, most people don't mean a defense of the Pope. they tend to use that term to mean you're trying to explain away what is obviously a problem with the Pope. I think that's what most people tend to mean when they say Popesplaining.
Yeah. I'll tell you, as a guy, okay, so I don't want to present myself as some big theologian who understands everything, but my theological training and certainly my prayer life, and where those two things kind of converge, and all that kind of stuff, it has not left me thinking that the Pope is an anti-Pope. Mm-hmm. It has not left me thinking that I have a lot to worry about with this Pope. If the Pope really, really wanted to mess things up, he would have done it on day one. Like he would have, if the Pope was intent on like undermining everything that the church has ever stood for, he would have done he would have done some things differently day one, right? And he hasn't. Instead, we've now had a Pope for over a decade, and you're going to have a hard time finding any way that he changed the doctrine of the church. You could maybe make the case in one or two spots that he's trying to develop the doctrine in a way that will lead to a change, or he's talking about things. I'm thinking of the death penalty, for example,
sure. Yeah.
where certainly he's using some strong language that is that you got to think about. But I would say I think you're in la la land as soon as you say Pope Francis is not the Pope; he's an anti-Pope, and you start calling him Bergoglio, and all that kind of stuff. Like that's a
fake fraud of a Pope.
I believe that there's a very unfortunate illness there that I hope you can shake it off. If you feel that way, I hope you can shake it off.
I don't know. Did you get a chance to read his new letter to the United States bishops on the issue of immigration?
Yeah, I skimmed over it, so I didn't study it or anything like that. I skimmed over it. I want to say this about those kinds of issues, right? Where it seems like there's an issue where politics and faith and morals and all those kind of things kind of start to converge into one spot. That popes are in a very special place as the vicar of Christ and as the shepherd and all of that. That without the temporal power that politicians and the temporal responsibility that politicians have, that our civic leaders have. Okay, so I'm thinking of John Paul II, for example, who says that every war is a failure for humanity, and yet we know that just war. Yeah. You can have a just war, right? You can have something that qualifies as a just war. So. You've had, the church teaches that it's possible to use, for example, the possession of nuclear weapons to deter, that mutually assured destruction has its advantages for keeping peace between the nations, right? And yet at the same time, every weapon of mass destruction is, the use of weapons of mass destruction is an intrinsic evil. So you can believe both things at the same time. And so I think a lot of what the Pope is saying, well, he's got to say that. He's the Pope. Like he has to say that deportation and even the word deportation, I think what he's thinking is something like, getting rid of all the Christians out of Iraq, or these massive deportations. I think of, for example, the Trail of Tears in America, with the Native Americans or things like that, where you look at that and you say, okay, I see what's happening there. You have people who are in a place and they're just getting moved out because of their race or because of their whatever. That's typically. I think that's what the Pope is thinking of in terms of.
You're talking about John Paul II?
I'm talking about Pope Francis, right? With what he said about deportations, right? So he's using the word deportations in a way that I think relates to situations that on the ground in the United States, certainly not every person that is deported or every situation where a person is deported falls into that category, right? So there are some ways in which we have to enforce our laws, and the Pope says that as well, right? That we have to enforce our laws about and the integrity of our borders and all that. Look, this is an issue that's very near and dear to me, right? I've worked on the border. I've worked in El Paso. I've lived in Mexico for a year, working with people who were coming from places more south than Mexico, working their way up to the United States. And so I've met a lot of these people, and I have a lot of personal contacts with a lot of This is an important issue to me, that these people be treated with respect. And I'm also a law-abiding American who thinks that everybody ought to obey even our immigration laws are important laws to obey. And so I think it's easy for me to imagine that the Pope has read the way that the news has portrayed the issue, which often misses both sides of what I just described. Right? It instead is trying to score a lot of the media. They're trying to score political points, and so they miss the real tragedy. Like I'll tell you, I've met a 13-year-old girl. I was living in Mexico. I met a 13-year-old girl who was coming from Guatemala, and she was being, I think, looking back on it now, I think it was probably what you would call trafficked into the United States. And she thought, and her family thought, whatever dangers come out of being brought to the United States, it's okay, because if you can get to the United States early enough, you'll qualify for DACA. You'll be a dreamer. And so this young girl was facing what I mean, I'd never wish that on anybody. And there she was thinking, yeah, but if I can just get to the United States, America will accept me and allow me. If I can just get there, I'll say that I'm a refugee. I'll say whatever I got to say, and I'll be accepted as an American, and they'll never kick me out. Now that's on us as Americans with our laws. That's a huge problem that we have, that we are enticing people to put themselves at great risk to come to the United States, and our laws are so broken that they're nearly impossible to enforce. And now the only way we can enforce them is to catch people who've broken those laws and ship them back to wherever they came from. And man, oh man, there's just a lot of heartache there, and a lot of chance for abusive people once again. So all of a sudden you can imagine there, and I think there are stories already starting to surface of people being sent back home in ways that we would say is beneath the dignity of a human person, right? So this problem is big. There's all kinds of, it's complex. There's no good guys and bad guys in this story. There's a lot of big problems. And so the Pope has spoken up in a way that I think is analogous to John Paul II, saying every war is a failure for humanity, even though we know that there's such a thing called just war. I think the Pope is in a similar situation right now. If he's trying to make our conscience come awake and see what's happening. And I respect him for that. I do. I respect him for that. I also think that we have to enforce our laws.
Sure. Now, setting aside the issue of immigration and however legitimate the Pope's concerns may be, I guess one concern that I have is he addresses this issue specifically and very, very forcefully speaks out against some things that J.D. Vance has been promoting, and of course Trump's policies. Again, let's just assume all that is completely legitimate, and you've made a pretty good case that it is. My concern is that, well, he addresses that, but didn't really seem to address the issues that we saw with Biden and Pelosi. Even in the case with Pelosi, I mean, her bishop basically said she can't receive communion.
Right.
She goes to Rome, and Rome gives her communion. And then the Pope basically, in a very indirect way, criticized, I mean, he wasn't very explicit by name, but he did criticize the bishop for that move that he made. And it really seemed to undermine the local bishop's authority. So it seems that he tends to be pretty selective in some cases in things that he wants to address. And I think that's caused a lot of people to be very, very concerned and even offended. It's like, why are you intervening in this issue but not other issues like abortion policies and stuff like that? Even though he's spoken out against abortion,
of course,
there's more he could have done to address that issue with Biden and Pelosi and others. Can you maybe speak to this?
Okay, so first of all, I don't have any insider knowledge for like any. I don't know anybody who knows anything about this. This so like don't everything I'm about to say. There's a healthy dose of conjecture in everything I'm about to say. But I believe that the Pope, whose English is not very good, his only access to what's going on in the United States is coming through people that he communicates with, and that I think that he's probably being led to his conclusions and led to the the urgency that he needs to act, led to that belief by a number of people who are either in the United States and very partisan, or maybe people who are in Europe who don't understand America very well. So I think I don't want to say I just give the Pope a pass, that way or whatever, but it seems to me like if I just try to put myself in the Pope's shoes. And I say, how would I know what in the world is going on in the United States? Well, probably try to buddy up with a couple of cardinals that might be from the United States, and I'm just going to have to trust what they tell me is true and the right take on it. And in fact, I'm probably just going to tell these guys, if I really trust these guys, I'm probably going to say, hey, whatever your take is, I'll back you on it. In fact, why don't you write this letter to the American bishops and I'll put my name on it? I imagine that those kinds of things happen. And so I think if you're, to really critique the Pope's relationship with the United States, you got to also recognize he's also from Argentina, and a lot of Latin America has some strong feelings about the United States as well, and feels like maybe the United States is on top at the expense of a lot of Latin American countries, and that's just sort of like a narrative that a lot of Latin Americans have about the United States. The United States is thriving, we're not thriving, and it's the United States' fault, right? If you grow up hearing that all the time, and then you've got an American cardinal who might be telling you something that just reinforces that narrative. It would be very clear to me that if those voices are all politically aligned a certain way, that it might be easy as the Pope to sort of just slip into the same sort of paradigm, whenever you look at the world. And so I would bet that if you were to line everything out in a perfectly, and then you were to present it to the Pope, which I think at least some people probably have. When I read what he writes every time this letter, for example, to the American bishops, shows there's a couple little lines in there that you're like, oh, here's a guy who he does recognize that borders are important. He does recognize that there are some things where you can see he's got some nuance to what he's trying to say. But the thrust of what he's saying feels like it goes...
The emphasis.
The emphasis feels like it goes, to put it in political terms, it goes easier on the Democrats than he does on the Republicans. He seems to go easier on them. Well, I mean, who's he listening to? I don't know, but it seems like he's probably listening to people who are politically aligned a certain way, or who are at least trying to be in a good relationship with politicians in a certain party, and less, feel like there's less hope getting on, Donald Trump's good side or JD Vance's good side. So why even try? So there may have been, some of this might have been an attempt to work things out with a different administration. These are all just some thoughts. I don't have any insider information. That's what I think is happening. From what I can gather,
Well, that's helpful in putting it into perspective. It's going to cause a lot of resentment for people, though, regardless of his intentions and motivations. Yeah. I think some people are just going to feel like, okay, he's just targeting certain groups and giving a pass to others.
I'll tell you this: the Pope does not seem to be too worried about being resented.
Yeah, I can tell.
He doesn't seem too worried. He does. I will say this: he does seem worried that the Catholic Church might be resented, right? So he doesn't want people to think the Church is mean, right? He doesn't want people to think that the Catholic Church is closed off. He doesn't want people to think the Church is that way. But for he himself, he seems to be pretty. I think the kids call this based. The Pope just doesn't seem to care if a politician doesn't like him, or if a theologian doesn't like him, or whatever. He just kind of doesn't seem to care. And whether or not that's a good strategy, I don't know. Whether or not he's just, I couldn't tell you. But that doesn't seem to be a concern.
I'm talking about the average, Catholic. I don't know. Maybe the average Catholic loves Pope Francis. I don't know. But I do see a lot of people holding a lot of resentment. Sometimes because of misplaced judgments that they've made about Pope Francis based on misinformation. And sometimes because they have some legitimate concerns. Yeah. Either way, you would hope that he would want to address those issues with people holding resentment against him, whether it's just or, whether it's based on legitimate criticisms or not.
Maybe so. Maybe so. Maybe if to put it in a different way, maybe he takes this, and this is maybe, right? Maybe he just takes this as I don't need to be a popular pope with every American. I don't need to be a popular pope. I need to be a pope who's history is going to judge me on whether or not I spoke out against a great tragedy. And is Nancy Pelosi receiving communion a great tragedy? In the same way that what he might think is a giant mass deportation a great tragedy. And the truth is, at least today, and we're speaking about this in mid-February of 2025, it looks like the policies for deportation are very close to what the policies were under Obama, right?
Yes.
That Trump, at least in terms of the execution of it, Trump is about on pace with where Obama was. But people didn't say this under Obama.
Right.
People didn't feel like it was people weren't afraid of
it now.
They're saying it now.
Which is why people feel like, okay, this is targeting.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about it. I think that the conversation is infused with some political agendas and some political one-upsmanship and political, sort of framing of things that make it seem like, these guys are always wrong, these guys are always right, and let's be patient with these guys, but not with those guys. And I would bet that the Pope is not immune to those kinds of framings, especially if if he's being fed his information. Through whether or not he's reading like the Spanish version of Newsweek, or whether or not he's talking to a cardinal who speaks Spanish very well, or whether or not he's who he's close to, or whatever. The world is messed up, man. The world is messed up. It's wounded, and I just wish everybody agreed with me all the time and saw things through my eyes. If they saw it through if
everything would be fixed,
right? If everybody knew what I knew, the world would be so much better. No, I mean, look, but for the grace of God, go I, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe I am there too. Like maybe it's me who's wrong. Maybe it's me who lives in a bubble. Maybe I watch only one news station, and that's why I think the way that I think, or something like that. So, I would encourage anybody who finds themselves just discouraged by that to just ask themselves, am I the victim of the very same thing? Mm-hmm. And if I hope that God forgives me for being myopic in my views or closed off to new ideas or whatever, that if God forgives me for those sins, let's also hope that God forgives anybody else who has the same problem, even if they're on the other side.
And that's fair. I have one more question for you. We've seen some bishops speak about excommunicating people enforcing Trump's border policies, like border agents. We've seen bishops speak about excommunicating them, not giving them communion, but I don't recall seeing a similar conversation about people, promoting abortion and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It seems like the conversation about excommunication and withholding communion is pretty selective. What are your thoughts here, and what are really the instances in which communion can be withheld?
Yeah. Okay. So those are really big questions. Yeah. I would say that you have a couple things you want to always remember. That saying that I was just doing my job is never a good excuse. It's never a good excuse. I was just doing my job. That can't be. You can go to hell for that, right? you can be in big trouble. Whatever you're doing, being your job doesn't get you out of trouble. I don't know of any situations in which a border patrol agent would be that there's some intrinsic evil that a border agent is being asked to commit some intrinsic evil. I don't know of any situations like that. Maybe there are some, but I don't know of any. That you can't make the case for what they're doing is right. Now, of course, if you're abusing your power as a border patrol agent and all that kind of stuff, but that's true. That's true no matter who the administration is. That's true for police officers. It's true for anybody with any kind of authority. If you abuse that authority, that's a sin, and you gotta stop that, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know how. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I really don't know where that kind of thing would come from. Maybe they know things I don't know. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're closer to a situation I'm not close to. There is some theological nuance here about supporting, let's say, or being part of a political party that you're not allowed to promote abortions, but there is a different way that you have to look at it. If you say, well, I tolerate people who commit abortions, or I believe that the law should, at least American law, is written in such a way that, I'm trying to make a case for something I don't believe, so forgive me for not being articulate here. But, somebody who basically says, like, American laws, American freedoms ought not restrict abortions because, there's something about, because it's on religious grounds that we're opposed to it or something like that. I mean, I don't believe any of that stuff. I'm not just pro-life. I mean, you might even describe me as an abolitionist when it comes to this kind of stuff. Like I don't want to bend even a little bit when it comes to this sort of stuff. So it's hard for me to even try to save that. But I would say too that people get really passionate about the things they're really passionate about, and less so about other things. And so there's things that keep me up at night that don't keep other people up at night, and vice versa. Not everybody can care about all the same things all at once. And so I try not to hold it against somebody just because they're very passionate about one thing, but not all the things I'm passionate about. I try not to hold that against somebody. But like John Paul II said, there's a when it comes to abortion, this is the primordial, this is the very, like if you don't get abortion right, you're not going to get anything else right. And I firmly believe that St. John Paul II was right on that. That's exactly correct in my mind. It's not just a preeminent issue. It's like a fundamental issue that you got to get right. So I pray for the day that everybody sees it that way.
What I'm concerned about is seeing people talk about withholding communion from situations like those involving immigration policies. But when it comes to people acting on same-sex attraction or people committing abortions, you get a very different message. You get a message of God loves you as you are. You're welcome. Just a very different message that you would think also would apply to people who are sinning on immigration policies. Yeah. But it doesn't seem that they're the same message. Thoughts here?
I'm coming from a place where I've heard a lot of confessions, and I know how hard it is for people to live with the fact that maybe an abortion was part of their past, that they feel very, very guilty about, and that is nature. Like if a woman who kills her child in the womb, of course you're going to feel bad about this. And I say this very delicately, that's only natural that you'd feel very bad about this, right? And there's only one solution to this, and it's forgiveness by God, right? There's only one solution that's going to work. And so, I think that there's probably a lot of people who are doing their very best to be, maybe they see, and this is just me making an excuse for them, but maybe they see, the very hardcore anti-abortion stuff. Well, that's only going to make these poor women who've had abortions, who want to reconcile themselves with the church, it's going to make it that much harder. You're just putting up barriers that way. I don't believe that, but maybe somebody does believe that, and maybe that's why they lay off the abortion stuff.
Maybe, but you would think they would apply the same thing to people who are committing immigration sins, right?
You got me.
You would think so, look, right? I'm just looking for consistency. That's all. I don't know why there is a consistency.
You're not going to get a real argument from me about that. You're not going to get a real argument from me. Yes, I agree with you. I'm just, I'm trying to see it. I'm trying to see it. I'm trying to understand where that might be. But at the end of the day, for me, I can't think of some sin that is worse than abortion, but there are lots of intrinsic evils, right? A lot of intrinsic evils. I just think that if you get abortion wrong, you're going to get everything else wrong too.
That's fair. Last question as a follow-up though. When can you withhold communion as a priest?
Well, when I'm distributing communion, if someone presents themselves for communion in a way that I think is going to scandalize everyone else, that is a good time to withhold communion. So I'll give you an example. I've never like withheld communion from someone who obviously was trying to receive communion. I've just never been in a situation where that was the right thing to do. But this very morning, I was distributing communion. I was giving out communion, and someone who I knew wasn't Catholic, and I knew that there were a bunch of people in the crowd weren't Catholic. I think I can just say this. This is one of our newer coaches, and I was saying Mass for the team, and I knew the whole team knew that this guy wasn't Catholic, and he just hadn't been enough Catholic. He's never worked at a Catholic school before, and he shows up and he does what everybody else does, and he walks up and I could tell by his body language that he didn't know what he was doing, and I remembered that he wasn't Catholic, and so I just said, "You're not Catholic, huh?" And I'm smiling the whole time, trying to be just as friendly as I can be about it. And he goes, "Right," and I said, "Well, may God bless you, protect you from all evil." Right? I gave him a blessing, and we did that, and he kind of smiled, and he seemed relieved that I picked up on what was going on. That's not quite the same thing as denying communion, but it was a good example of, like, I knew that if he received communion, the entire team would go like, Congratulations, you just received your first communion. You know, yeah, I guess you're Catholic now. You know, that kind of thing. So that was an example of where I asked the question, "Are you Catholic?" Right. We have to be very careful as the person who is the minister of communion that we not use that moment as a time to judge the worthiness or the place someone's. Did they go to communion? Did they go to confession recently or not? That's not the time and the place to make that judgment, right? I will tell you that there are a number of sort of like very visible people, that I would think it would be the right thing to do to not give them communion based on things that they've publicly said, and it would scandalize people. So you might have to withhold communion that way. I've just never personally been in a situation where I had to do that.
Yeah.
I had to withhold communion from a monkey one time, right?
What in the world?
Right.
We got hats and monkeys.
Right.
Huh?
So I was in a prison in Bolivia, and
Okay.
I was not incarcerated in Bolivia, but I was working in a prison in Bolivia.
Okay.
And a prisoner came up who had a monkey on his shoulder,
Wow.
and that monkey wanted communion in the worst kind of way, and
Wow.
I couldn't see myself giving communion to the monkey. Right?
You have some weird stories. I love this. We need to do a whole show just going through the odd scenarios that you've been through.
Yeah. But it's not the time to judge a person's their state of grace when they present themselves for communion. Mm-hmm. That's on them, right? But you should judge. If the person walks up and they're clearly intoxicated, let's say, and they're shouting obscenities, or, who knows what. You ought to refuse communion to somebody who's going to cause scandal to everybody else there. Mm-hmm. Now, as it turns out, that's rare, because if someone's coming up in communion and most people can't see what's going on between the priest and the person presenting himself for communion, so there's not a whole lot of times where you would deny them communion. But if it causes scandal, you should not give communion to somebody.
Where can people go to find out more about your channel?
If you search Fr John Brown SJ, you'll find me that way. If you search John Brown, you'll get the abolitionist, Harper's Ferry, John Brown that way. There's also another guy. I think he's like he's not a Catholic priest, but he's some kind of clergy member of some other denomination. If you look,
it's a common name, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty common name, right? So you can do that. I think you'll find it. Sometimes you might search Que Viva, like Queek Viva, it's the response in Spanish to Viva Cristo Rey. If somebody says Viva Cristo Rey, the response is always Que Viva. And so
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I've heard that phrase from your channel. I just didn't know what it was.
That's where that comes from. Right.
Okay. Well, I'll put a link also to that.
Awesome.
To
Thank
that
you
in the show notes.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Father Brown. Really
hey, look, I
enjoyed
always love visiting with you. Thank you for having me again.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Are you seeking clarity in the midst of confusion about Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism? In my book, Answering Orthodoxy, I offer a biblical and historical response to the most common objections the Eastern Orthodox offer against the Catholic Church. This book is for anyone searching for the truth, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, or simply trying to make sense of the differences between Catholics and Orthodox. Order your copy today and discover the rational, biblical, and historical basis for the Catholic Church. Visit Amazon to order your copy today. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/reason and theology.